Chairman, you may proceed.
Thank you. I'd like to open this meeting of the Planning Commission, the regular monthly meeting on December 10th, 2021 at 2 p.m. I'd like to call the roll, please, or will the secretary please call the roll? Now that we have an officer as a secretary, please call the roll.
Oh dear. Barry Covington.
Here.
John Dewey.
Here.
Mr. Dewey is muted, I believe.
Mr. Dewey, please unmute yourself.
Here.
Mr.
Okay.
Dewey, do not unmute yourself. Please mute your microphone. You need to speak into the boom microphone that's in front of you, directly into it.
Okay, moving on. We can see that you're here. Steve Kaufman.
Present, thank you.
Van Hutter.
Here.
Jim Ellison.
Here.
Mike Strange.
Here.
Rachel Macha. Here. And our chair, Mr. Bryan.
Yes, present. Thank you. Ms. Womack, would you please announce the verification of the meeting notice?
The agenda was posted in City Hall and on the portal on December 2nd. It was amended and reposted on December 7th. Chair, that's all I have.
All right. I'd like to call the meeting to order then. We have an abbreviated agenda today of primarily two items. One is 330 Rehoboth Avenue, a change of zoning request, and the other is the consideration by the Planning Commission of the revised draft comprehensive development plan. Given the time constraints and given the time that we're spending and need to spend to move forward on the CDP, we will have public comment as part of the agenda item for the 330 Rehoboth matter, but we will not have public comment as part of the matter of the consideration of the CDP. And I'd just like to let you know that depending on the progress we make, we may need to have one additional special meeting of the Planning Commission in late December, early January. Again, we're trying to see just to gauge how far along we've come and what progress we've made and how much distance we still have to travel about the CDP. That has to be our primary focus at this time. Having said that, could we have a report by Tom West and perhaps Glenn Mandalis on the 330 Rehoboth change of zone request matter?
Mr. Chair, I could start. I'll just go through, describe the application. So 330 Rehoboth Avenue is a request for a zoning change for a portion of a property that's currently zoned R1, about 19,000 square feet plus, to the C1 Central Commercial District. It's at the corner of Rehoboth Avenue and State Road. The application came in originally in 2019. Some matters were taken care of. It was reviewed and submitted again to the Planning Commission. Planning Commission reviewed it in May, June, and most recently, I believe, August. At that time, the Planning Commission reviewed the matter. It was presented to the Planning Commission. The applicant spoke. The discussions involved reconsidering some of the aspects of the application in terms of zoning, specifically the permitted uses in the area of the property currently zoned R1 that could be zoned, that would be zoned under the request as C1. And at that time, the Planning Commission asked the applicant to consider ways of limiting the uses on the property and the extension of the development. The idea that was discussed was a set of covenants that have been drafted. Originally, I think the Planning Commission reviewed one set, and there was still some thoughts on the list of permitted uses. The city solicitor and I've met with the applicant on a couple of occasions. They've since submitted a revised set of covenants that are in the agenda packet. So the whole application and these revised set of covenants are there for the Planning Commission's consideration.
All right, sir. Mr. Mandelis, do you have anything to add?
Sure, I can add the revised covenant, the changes predominantly, and Mr. Hutt, I'm sure will go through it, but the changes predominantly are at section 1, the covenant would be recorded within 10 days of a final approval of a site plan for a hotel with commercial uses. So that's a new addition. They also, at section 5, instead of listing those things that will not be on the site, that's all been deleted, and now it provides that the use of the property shall be limited to a hotel with commercial uses on the first floor, as generally shown on a concept site plan that's attached to Exhibit A. So that's a switch in that they're identifying what would be there versus what will not be there. And then I don't think any changes were made to section 7, which was the limitation on any vertical building in the area where the parking has traditionally been located. So those are the changes that I saw, but I'm sure Mr. Hutt will go through it as well.
Is there a time limit on these, on this agreement? Is this a, we look
30 years from the date of recordation, I believe, Chair, and also in section 1.
Okay. Anything else from Mr. West or Mr. Mandelis at this time?
Not for me.
Okay, does the applicant wish to speak? Mr. Hutt? You're muted, Mr. Hutt.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Great. For the record, my name is David Hutt, representing the applicant. As you know from our prior visits, sitting with me in the room today is Betty Gallo, one of the principals of the venture. I think Mr. Lockwood may be listening online. He was unable to join us here today, but he was trying to call in and listen in that way and participate. Very briefly, you've heard from Mr. West and Mr. Mandelis. At the October meeting, as you all likely recall, there was discussion about the first version of the draft restrictive covenant that I prepared on behalf of my client to try to address some of the concerns about potential uses of this property. The tenor of that meeting was that initially, I believe that there were additional uses that the commission would like to have seen excluded, and sort of the undertone, if I would, of that meeting was that if there was a way to do it, that the hotel, just say that it's going to be a hotel was sort of the bottom line, and say, you know, what is going to be there. After the October meeting, as indicated by Mr. West and Mr. Mandelis, I had some video conferences or virtual conferences with them regarding this. If you were to look online and see right now how the restrictive covenant is referred to, it's referred to as version 3. I think you see a V3 on it. There is a version 2 that I don't believe the Planning Commission was given, but they may have been. Mr. West and Mr. Mandelis had it when we were working through I was working through some drafting issues with them. And version 2 essentially did two things. It took the first version and then added to it some additional uses that would be prohibited on the site. And then it added the vertical construction limitation that is section 7 in what you have in front of you today. So that is new from the original restrictive covenant that you saw. And the purpose of that is to set dimensionally where this structure could be. One of the concerns that numerous members of the Planning Commission referenced was the concern that a neighbor, particularly those in the country club estates, would have, for the first time in their history, could have a structure right next to them rather than a parking lot. And so what was done was I prepared some language about a vertical construction limitation, and you can see the outline of the of the hotel building. And then what's written in there is a 5-foot, call it buffer, in case that design changes as final engineering is done, because the hotel has not been finally engineered yet. So there's a 5-foot little bit of leeway there. But the bottom line of that, the result of that, is that if you were to travel on State Road, the closest that vertical construction would be to that next property is a little over 106 feet away. So there'd be a restrictive covenant that prevented vertical construction from being closer than that to the next property as you move towards down State Road. After reviewing that, the version 2 restrictive covenant with Mr. West and Mr. Mandalis again, and this actually the conversation arose after your November meeting, there was concern expressed that even with adding a couple of other prohibited uses, that it didn't go as far. Mr. West and Mr. Mandalis were concerned that it didn't go as far as they felt that the Planning Commission wanted it to go. And so what occurred at that point was that we took out all of the prohibited uses and just simply stated what was going to be there. And you can see section 5 went from being one of the lengthier sections of the restrictive covenant to being a fairly short restrictive covenant, which limits the use to a hotel with commercial uses on the first floor. And that's a retail, restaurant, and a spa, which are shown on that concept plan, which is attached as Exhibit A to the restrictive covenant. And that likely, hopefully, addresses the concerns that were raised at the October Planning Commission meeting. And in addition, while we were not, we asked to be removed from the agenda for the November 12th meeting, as you likely recall, there was one speaker at the November 12th meeting who spoke on 330 Rehoboth Avenue, and that was Mr. Saunders, who I understand is the president of the Rehoboth Beach Homeowners Association. And his comment was that along the lines of that his concern was for the adjoining lot on State Street, and that he and his group were fine. The exact words were fine with that in referring to a proposed hotel, but that their concern was what happened if it wasn't a hotel for the folks who live on State Street. And hopefully this proposed restrictive covenant addresses that concern, as it says that it's going to be a hotel and the parking lot's going to be where the parking lot has historically been. And there are restrictive covenants that, whether it's the city or an adjacent neighbor, they're all identified there, they could restrict it. Those are the changes from what the Planning Commission considered in October. And we're happy to answer any questions, Mr. Bryan, that members that you or other members of the commission or the staff or professionals the city has may have.
All right, sir. We may come back to that if we hear after public comment. I'd like to, if that's okay, I'd like to go ahead and have the public comment section happen now, and then the Planning Commission can discuss and perhaps ask questions as needed of you or Ms. Gallo. So having said that, at this point, I have a series of speakers signed up, which I assume are all for this matter. And if I can, I'll start with Saurabh Shrivastava. Are you available, sir? I see that you're signed in on the screen, but I don't know if you are here. All right, next, Mr. Rick Perry.
He is not on the call.
He is or is not?
He is not on the call.
All right. Carlton Savage.
Not on the call.
Ryan Merritt.
Not on the call.
Well, this is a much more brief section of the meeting than I had anticipated. Members of the Planning Commission, would you like to discuss this matter, and do you have any questions for the applicant? Mr. Kaufman.
Why don't you let Mr. Strange go first?
Okay, thanks, Steve. I have still a basic question, and I guess a conundrum on this is with regard to the original supposition that our legal counsel said that we're really supposed to consider the original request that the Board of Commissioners gave to us was whether or not this parcel, the other parcel, the residentially zoned parcel, should be converted to C1. And then I think, and I don't want to speak for Glenn, but then he said that if the applicant had proffered something independent of what our charge was, that still could be considered as part of the equation. So I guess I have one question to Glenn is that still the case?
So yeah, it is the case. We originally started talking about traditionally a zoning decision should be, purely a decision about that parcel of land and that particular zoning designation and not about any particular construction proposal. This process has evolved as it oftentimes does in a rezoning request. I mean, it's typically planning commissions are reluctant to grant a change of zone without having some indication as to what would likely be there. So, and it's fine when a developer makes a proffer to consider that proffer and what might be there. It would be inappropriate for you as a planning commission to say, we'll give you the zoning if you give us this, and you list what you would like to have there. That is traditional contract zoning. But when a developer comes in to give you some assurances about what might be on the parcel in the form of a proffer, that moves you out of the contract zoning range. Now you're still it's a kind of gray area, I will admit, but we're at a point where there's been proffers made and the planning commission has considered them. It's probably about time for the planning commission to consider this in earnest and get to a decision sooner rather than later. I think we've done enough where we're starting now to get in a back and forth, and I wouldn't want it to get into that kind of a negotiated process.
Okay, excuse me. In light of that, one of the issues I've had, and I still have, and I'm not sure it's been addressed, and it's not related to the specific application by Mr. Hutt and the use of the property as a hotel. It gets back to the original supposition of whether this should be handled by a rezoning and the sequencing of it, which I still have problems of with regard to the language. But whether or not it should be treated as an exception from the standpoint of leaving the zoning the way it is and have the applicant seek a variance with the support of the planning commission for a specific site plan, because we're still dealing with a conceptual drawing and not a reality yet, which is of concern to me. So I'm not sure who I'm addressing that question to. I guess both to Glenn and to the rest of the commissioners is that's where my posture is right now. I think we've got the cart before the horse, and I think it's only going to get us into more trouble. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Stephen.
Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you. I think several things have occurred that puts the Planning Commission in a position to recommend approval of this rezoning. First, let's remember that the request was from the Board of Commissioners as to whether or not this board recommends that they consider this property for rezoning in a positive way. First and foremost, I think, is the fact that the applicant has now come forward and proffered a covenant that restricts it to strictly the one use, which is really where I felt they should have gone from the beginning. And they've also made that covenant, the beneficiaries of that covenant, not only the city, but the surrounding neighbors. So I think that's very significant in that the covenant is enforceable not only by the city, but by the surrounding neighbors. Another thing that's occurred, which I think is significant, is that recently the city adopted a new FAR, or FAR piece of legislation, which means that every aspect of this property, when it's developed, will be considered towards the FAR. So in addition to the code requirements of the FAR in the section of the zoning ordinance, every other element of this property will be considered. Thirdly, they also approved a piece of legislation recently which would allow for underground parking, which allows this applicant to state that there will not be any structure on the piece of property that was residential that would be zoned commercial, and that predominantly there will be parking underground. Another reason is that the idea of having a property split zoned is never a good idea, because then you have two different categories of standards to apply, notwithstanding that they've limited it to a hotel. Another major reason I think that we're in a position to approve this is that this property will be required to go through site plan. To address Mr. Strain's issue, they will not be able to move forward until this applicant comes forward after zoning to the Planning Commission to have us review it for a full site plan. That is much better than to ask the Board of Adjustments for waivers. Waivers are not the way to go in the future. You really need zones that allow significant flexibility, that you don't have to constantly ask for variances, which really should not be approved unless there's extreme hardship. And that does not apply here. And I think the city should get away, that's just an aside, from from going to the Board of Adjustments for these hardship waivers. Let's just see if I have anything else. I think that pretty well sums it up. Lastly, I think this is a very appropriate location for this type of use. It's at the entrance to the city, the gateway. They've given assurances to their surrounding neighbors. The city the property has been empty for a long time, has become an eyesore, and has had rodents and other things inside. It's time for us to give them our support and let them go, and let the decision on zoning be made by the Board of Adjustments after full public hearings. Thank you.
All right.
Could I just ask some point of information? Steve, you referred to the city adopting new legislation with regard to the FAR. Are you referring to the variance granted by the Board of Adjustment recently?
No, I'm talking about the legislation that was approved, which changed the definition of FAR to include just about every element of a project in the commercial zone.
All right. Okay, I understand. I understand what you're saying then. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would second Steve's point too, and just add one more point to it, and that is that the CDP specifically talks about the redevelopment of Rehoboth Avenue at the southern end.
All right. Anyone else?
I think it would be useful if there were a motion on the floor.
Well, we haven't got to that yet, but I'll be glad to make it.
We still have public who haven't spoken yet. I see Mr. Swasta.
We're a little bit out of order here because the gentleman who signed up to speak wasn't present when I called on him.
Exactly.
And now he's joined back in. And at the risk of creating a bit of a back and forth that I really don't want to see happen, I could call on him right now, but I think that sets a bad precedent. If you're going to sign up to speak, you need to be available when you're called on. So having said that, let's continue our planning commission discussion first rather than just stopping that. Ms. Macha.
I would just like to also agree with Steve and Barry's comment. I was going to make the very same one about the CDP. But the other thing that I was just kind of overall thinking about, as Steve was walking through the points, many of which I was thinking about as well, is this group has done exactly what we've asked them to do, right? We had a conversation up front, back to Mike Strange's comments around, should this be a variance or should this not? And as we've talked about the covenants, they've gone away and they've come back with covenants that I think absolutely spell out the intent and use of this property. And I do think it would be a really nice corner as we enter Rehoboth. As we've talked about, that building has been sitting there dilapidated for at least 15 years, if not more. So I really believe that we are in a position as a planning commission to make a decision on this today.
All right, anyone else? Mr. Strange.
Yeah, it's interesting because I actually agree with what Barry, Steve, and Rachel said philosophically. And I agree with all of that. I guess the problem I'm having is one of sequencing with regard to what's being offered versus what the charge was that we were given. And that technically, we could go ahead and approve what the commissioners have asked of us, is should the property be rezoned. And then the other one is related to this particular separate and therefore unrelated event of an applicant that wants to build a hotel. And then the question then becomes the sequencing of what's being offered. So, you know, we go ahead and we say and we recommend to the commissioners that we think this property should be rezoned to C1. And then in the interim, because at least the way I read it, and maybe I'm reading it wrong, is that there's a time delay between what's being offered and what the applicant may ultimately elect to do after the site plan has been reviewed. So to Steve's point, yes, we could review a site plan, but during the interim when this property has been rezoned, something could happen financially or from a business perspective that they desire to do something else or they drop it altogether. And that there's no obligation. I'm not asking people to sign up with yet another contract. But it's the philosophical issue of the timing of this and how it all plays out. And it's purely on that technical issue that I have a concern. Things change in business life and you never really can know what's going to happen in the future. So it's a conundrum for me, even though I agree exactly what Steve said and what Rachel said with regard to redevelopment of the property. So I'm hung up on that.
So this is a question for Glenn. Why can't we recommend that the property be rezoned subject to the covenant being approved? Or, you know, or that no building permit will be issued without the covenant being approved?
I think you could make that recommendation. I think what Mr. Strange is saying is that the city commissioners didn't say, let us know if it should be rezoned based upon the offer that they're making. They simply said, let us know if it should be rezoned. So that's one question. And then I think Mr. Strange was saying the other issue is, do we then make a second recommendation, I guess, as to what's being proffered and whether that's acceptable to the city. As to the sequencing, you know, I've thought about that as well. How do all the dominoes fall if this was approved so that the city has assurances that it's going to get what it thinks it's getting, the property isn't rezoned and then sold or something else before that happens. So I guess what I would offer to you for that is, I don't think the planning commission has to make that decision or know how that will occur. I think your role is to say, if you're inclined to vote yes, your role is to say, we like this proffer, we're voting yes to it, here are our concerns. So city commissioners, task your council to figure out how these concerns won't become a reality, and we'll get what we think we're getting. I don't think today we have to figure out the lawyering of how everything gets recorded and the dominoes fall. But I do see Mr. Strange's point where there's kind of two things on the table.
Mr. Kaufman.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and do what Julie said, which is make a motion that we recommend this property to the Board of Commissioners for rezoning, subject to the applicant bringing the proffer as part of the rezoning application to the Board of Commissioners and making it part of the application for rezoning. The application for rezoning has to be filed by the applicant. So subject to the proffer. So my motion is that we recommend approval, subject to the proffer, and to the other points that I made when I originally indicated that this is an appropriate property to be rezoned, including that this is not a place where we should have split zoning, including that it's an appropriate location for the use which they are proffering, and that it's important for the property to be revitalized under the guidance of the current adopted comprehensive development plan, which recommends this type of action for properties which are appropriate for commercial zoning. So I make that motion if anyone will.
I'll second it. I'll
Right.
second it.
We have a motion and we have a second and a second, I believe. I guess at this point
Julie
then,
Davis has comment. She's had her hand up for quite a while.
I'm sorry?
Julie Davis has a comment. She's had her hand up for quite a while.
Well, I have a question as to procedure. How is this vote going to be taken? Will each
call.
member of the commission be called on and allowed to give reasons, the basis for voting either yes or no?
Yes.
Or are we going to complete a discussion amongst ourselves and then vote with a simple yes or no without any further comment?
It will be a roll call and each commissioner will be asked to state their reasons for voting yes or no.
Okay, thank you. Well, I can hold my comments until I vote. Excuse me.
We have a motion and a second. Secretary, Mr. Ellison.
Yeah, I just have to step in and say that my principal concern about all of this really has to do with the setting of a bad precedent if we change this. The R1 portion of this property right now is virtually surrounded by residential. And I'm very concerned that we're setting a very bad example to those individuals, those property owners, if we just simply go ahead and recommend this. I realize that there are all these conditions, but in essence, what we would be doing is saying, yeah, let's go ahead and change the zoning. And I just don't think that's right.
Ms. Macho.
Jim, I would just have to disagree with you. I'm sorry on that point. We've already had the neighbors in the area come before us and tell us that they actually do believe that this property should be developed and they are supportive of this project. It is, sitting in C1. What we're trying to do here, as we've been talking about, is also getting to a single zone, which should have been done, honestly, probably 40, 50 years ago. So we have the neighborhood support here of this project.
That's not my recollection, but proceed.
No, I don't think so.
Mike?
Yes, ma'am.
As long as everybody else has commented before the vote, I will also. And I'd like to start with the with provisions in the CDP, the 2010 CDP. I realize there is that one sentence that everybody quotes to justify every developer's dream in the city. But the CDP also says in section 8.321, city policies for commercial land uses, the city will assure that its land use plan and zoning code are drawn to avoid any negative impacts of commercial development upon residential neighborhoods. It goes on to say in section 8.322 that in reviewing the zoning code, the city will eliminate any currently permitted commercial uses or categories of use that have clear potential for adverse impacts on residential neighborhoods. Now, I know the argument here today is that these covenants achieve what the CDP says is supposed to be achieved, and that is to assure against negative impacts from the development on nearby residential. But it also, and avoiding, commercial uses that have clear potential for impacts. I don't think these covenants achieve those goals. And first of all, as drafted, and Mr. Kaufman's motion assumes that the covenants that will accompany the zoning application were the covenants that are before us today. As drafted, you have the issue of when the covenants are going to become effective. And as they are currently drafted, they're not going to become effective until if and only if a site plan review is approved in addition to the rezoning. And as was brought up, You know, the property could be sold, there could be no owners, the rezoning would have occurred, the plans for the hotel could change. The current property owners could change their mind about putting a hotel on this property. And this is not assuring, this is not basically guaranteeing these residential property owners in nearby that surround the property that there won't be negative impacts from this, because if something happens in between zoning and site plan approval, a lot of unfortunate events could occur. But leaving that aside, regardless of what the terms are, I'm not happy with the enforcement provisions. I agree that this is a very important property for the city. I agree that it is a gateway, but I think all city residents and property owners have an interest in the future of this property. What we have here are covenants that are enforceable only by either a handful of surrounding property owners and neighbors or the city itself. And when I think of what a handful of property owners undertaking what will be protracted and very expensive litigation, and you know it will be inevitably, that those property owners are going to want to take on the risk not only of paying their own litigation costs, but again, the way the covenants are currently drafted, if they were to lose, they're going to have to pay the property owners, the applicants, the hotel owners, prospective hotel owners, litigation costs. And that could be enormous. And I think that amounts to, to use the common expression, a poison pill against litigation. And I realize that the city is also a benefited party, which means that it could sue to enforce the covenants, but I don't like to leave enforcements by the city to the vagaries of the city's politics and election processes, and assume that there would be 4 people at the appropriate time on the Board of Commissioners who would be willing and able to spend taxpayer dollars to pursue this very expensive litigation and also risk the possibility of having to pay the other side's costs. That is not the way the way attorneys' fees are assessed and costs of litigation generally in this country. It's the so-called British rule, and it reverses the British rule. And finally, and I will stop, I haven't heard anything from the applicant, the property owners, or any of their team members to show why a perfectly attractive, economically viable hotel can't and shouldn't be built on just the C1 portion of this property and leave the R run for its historic use as a parking lot for whatever use is being made on the C1 property. The hotel might not have the 90 rooms that the applicants are proposing, but the proposed Langford Hotel would have had 40 rooms. The Hotel Rehoboth has 52 rooms. The Belmore has 53 rooms. And even the Boardwalk Plaza has fewer than 90 rooms. So, as I say, leaving aside the terms of the covenants, the enforceability of the covenants, I just don't see that this proposal is not economically viable, because we have absolutely nothing on the table to indicate that.
I called the question.
I'm going to speak again before it's called. I want to speak again, please.
All right, Mr. Kaufman.
First of all, I think you've gone really far afield with these objections. As to Jim's comment, no one zoning case is a precedent for any other zoning case, and that's been held in many, many courts. And you can't say that this is a precedent that others will follow. As to Julie's comments, these people have gone bent over backward to address their neighbors. The city has the benefits of these covenants. And if you're worried about the fact that they won't go into effect until there's a site plan, they can modify it and say it'll go in effect as soon as the zoning is and prior to a site plan being approved. There's a lot of reaching for the stars here to say why we shouldn't rezone this property. No community can stay exactly like it is. And this property is a appropriate place for a hotel. If you're going to get a hotel either way, and if you get a hotel under the zoning that they're asking for, they have a lot more flexibility to do a top rate design, which will be much better than if you have to jam the whole thing on one little piece of property. And the incursion into the residential is very small. Now, I know that this may not get approved today, but the reasons that are being stated are really far afield, very speculative, and have nothing to do with the facts that have come in to this case. And we should, if we're going to do our thing and we're going to do it right, support these people and let them go before the Board of Commissioners with an application. This is ridiculous where we are going. Now you can call the question.
Well, yes, sir. Let's I call the question. We have a motion to approve, to recommend approval, and a second. Would the secretary please call the roll?
Mr. Covington?
I vote for, and rather than restate what Mr. Coughlin said in his motion, I will ask that those words support my motion, my vote to grant the motion.
Mr. Kaufman?
I vote yes, you know why.
Ms. Hunter?
I vote no, and I haven't spoken yet, so I am going to summarize my reasons. I share with Steve the sense, and I think with some others also, that these particular applicants have been put through what they may well consider to be an unnecessary set of hoops and steps. And I regret that. I think that I will point out that historically, and this goes back before I was on the Planning Commission, there were issues about who had title to the property. And so the delay here is not all on one side. Nonetheless, it's regrettable, I think, that it's been back and forth, and maybe a combination of better applications and faster procedures could address some of that. But my main concern here, a couple of main concerns. One is, these references to the CDP of 2010. I mean, pulling quotes, if not out of context, almost out of context, I think is something that is a wrong thing for us to do. We cannot rely on those. When a document has a general statement and a more specific statement or more pointed statement, the second category of statement applies. Julie Davis pointed out quotations from the section of the 2010 plan on commercial controls. I'll simply point out another quotation from that same section. This is from page 90. And I quote, "Because of the close proximity of many residential and commercial zones, the potential for adverse impacts of commercial activity upon residential neighborhoods is quite strong." And then the CDP goes on to say, as Julie has already quoted, so I won't repeat, that the city has an obligation to protect against those adverse impacts. And I will point out that that is not in a discussion of a rezoning application specifically. So I think that makes the point of our obligation to protect against adverse impacts even stronger than it might otherwise be. The issue of rezoning from residential to commercial is one that I think that we ought to be extremely hesitant to go down that road. There's plenty of land that's available for commercial development, and that's a good thing. And that includes part of the property that's under review here. I think we are that we don't have an adequate justification for downzoning from residential to commercial in this situation. And I think we ought to establish for ourselves what runs throughout the 2010 CDP, which is that there should be a high standard for that. The second major concern I have is with the draft covenants. And again, I appreciate the fact that the applicants spent time and effort redrafting in response to some of the questions that were raised at the last time that we considered, that the Planning Commission considered it. But as I stated the last time in the last meeting, I think the 30-year cap is really not an adequate way to protect the nearby residents. And the nearby residents are not all united in support of this. I think there's a division of opinion, but they're certainly not united in support of it. I think of the fact that I purchased my first property in Rehoboth more than 20 years ago, not quite 30 years ago. But if I were looking at that property now, and my property is not adjacent to this property, but if there were a comparable situation, and I thought that well, I have 30 years more, or I have, if when I bought it, I thought I had 30 years, today I'd be looking at the expiration of that 30 years. And I think we all know that 30 years can go by pretty quickly. So I appreciate the efforts of the applicants, but I think it's insufficient to protect the residents of the surrounding area. And I think that the standard that we should insist upon in considering any application, and I understand this may be a precedent setting in the sense it may be the first, I'm not sure about that there has been this kind of rezoning from residential to commercial. I think that the standard simply isn't met in this instance. I also agree with a number of the other points that Commissioner Davis made. I'm not going to repeat them for in the interest of time, but in terms of the reasoning behind this, I would ask that the record reflect my agreement with those statements as well.
Mr. Ellison?
You say Ellison?
Mr. Ellison?
Yes.
Jim?
Yes, I vote no, and I very much appreciate the much better language used by Nan Hunter and Julie Davis in noting the concerns that we have.
Mr. Strange?
I vote no, but it's a conflicted no, because I actually agree with most of what everyone has said, except for one small aspect of it. And that's with regard to change of causality. Steve said that, it's a bad idea to have split zoning. I agree completely with that. However, we have an historical perspective from the standpoint of this particular property where it got misused or abused, however you want to look at it, as a material fact. And nothing prevents the applicant, and this is why I mentioned earlier how I thought was a better solution to the issue. Nothing prevents the applicant from putting forth a site plan that does in fact require a portion of a variance for what is now currently an R designation. And quite frankly, if the same hotel that was proposed exactly as this one is, and it reached the point where it was a final presentation to the Board of Commissioners, I would support that and I would vote for it. And also indicate that we as a Planning Commission should go to the Board of Adjustment and support the variance for what's being shown. And by Mr. Hutt's own comment, it may change a little bit. They may find some things from an engineering standpoint that they need to modify, and they could still go forward and achieve their objectives. But I also agree with what Julie said about the time limitation associated here, and Nan alluded to this as well. 30, 20, 50, it's irrelevant. Change the causality. There's things that we don't think about now, that if we were to change the residential zoning to commercial for the totality of this property, a lot of weird things can happen. And I don't think we need to enter into that area at all, so we can take the affirmative action of willing to review a potential redevelopment using this hotel. It may get bigger, it may get smaller, whatever it is. And it may require additionally some land that's in the R1 designation. And that can be done fairly efficiently, and we'll know an absolute design as opposed to a sort of design, which we currently have. So it's based on, it is a conflicted vote from my standpoint. I'm voting no, and yet I agree with the applicant and almost whatever everyone else has said with regard to the benefits of doing it. But I think there's a real risk from the future if we were to do that. So my vote is no based on that. Thank you.
Ms. Macha?
I vote yes, and would like the record to reflect the same reasons that Steve Kaufman has already stated. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, do I vote next or do you
Yes.
vote next? I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yes, please.
I vote.
Yes.
Yes, I vote no. And I won't repeat what I had previously said, but I do want to just say that I don't think my reasons or my grounds for voting no were either far-fetched or far-reaching. They're based on two discrete provisions of these covenants that are before us. As far as I'm concerned, the inadequacy of the enforcement procedures and mechanisms, and the fact that covenants will not be effective until they're recorded, and they will not be recorded until after a site plan has been approved. And I realize Mr. Kaufman pointed out, well, the Board of Commissioners could change that, the applicant could change it, whatever. But for purposes of today, these are the covenants we're looking at, and these are the covenants that I'm voting on. So on that basis, I vote no on the recommendation to the Board of Commissioners to approve a rezoning.
Okay, and the chair votes no, and my reasoning is exactly what Ms. Davis has said and Ms. Hunter has said. But in a bigger picture, I don't want to recommend approval of this rezoning. This issue has been before us since last spring. There's been adequate opportunity for this to all get worked out. And in my view, I don't think it's appropriate to forward something with a positive recommendation to the Board of Commissioners when the details have not been worked out. And these are not small details. This business about when the covenants are recorded is a big deal to me. And Mr. Kaufman knows how that works in the real estate world. Covenants aren't binding until they're recorded. They don't impact the title to property until they're recorded among the land records. And I think that is a significant issue. Before we would send something to the Board of Commissioners saying, we approve this with the caveat that, oh, by the way, you got to straighten out these other issues. I don't think that's what we should be doing. I would, while I might support, if these issues were resolved, I might support recommending an approval for that, sending it on to the Board of Commissioners, but I'm not in favor of sending it on while there are still issues that need to be resolved and have not been. All right, I believe the count was 5-3 or 6-3.
So you didn't have another vote. You have another vote.
So Mr. Dewey.
John didn't vote.
That's right.
John Dewey.
Oh, John Dewey, I apologize. You've been quiet.
Himself, did he not?
He recused himself.
On this matter. He recused from this previously. That's why his video is not on.
Okay,
So,
I think we have voted.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
So the motion has failed, but we're not recommending anything because we did not recommend approval. So apparently we're not recommending anything. My problem with all of this is that the Board of Commissioners asked us to make a decision to whether or not whether we should recommend that they take a vote, that they rezone this property. We've not approved a motion to do it. And basically we're not making any recommendation whatsoever. I was a little concerned that the Board of Commissioners asked us in the first place to make a recommendation, because it's not normally what a planning commission does until there's been an application for rezoning. Usually in most jurisdictions, an application for rezoning comes in. At that point, the zoning body either goes forward with the hearing and makes a decision, or they can delegate it, for example, to a planning commission, which sometimes they do in Montgomery County, which is where I practice mostly. But I'm a little concerned that the Board of Commissioners sort of was handing this off because they didn't want to have to make a decision. I'm sorry that we didn't approve this. I understand that the applicant has now been given some direction to maybe go and ask for a variance. I think that's the wrong way for the city to be doing these things. We really should be having a zoning ordinance that allows for this type of property to be zoned. Most of the issues that have been raised, including the ones that Ms. Davis raised from the comprehensive development plan, you can find pretty much anything you want in the current comprehensive development plan to approve, to support or not support just about anything, because it's a general statement of a policy. It's not a specific statement. But I mean, the city's got to come to realize that, you know, if they're going to do things effectively, they have to entertain zoning applications by applicants directly, the Board of Commissioners, and not put us in the middle. And I'm afraid I got a little bit hot there. I apologize to everybody for that. Didn't mean to. But I think we should be doing things the way they should be done, which is appropriately following normal procedure. So I just wanted to make those comments. And basically, we're just not making any recommendation here. Yeah,
Well,
I'm
Mr.
sorry.
Kaufman, the chair would entertain a motion to recommend denial of the rezoning. You got ahead of me there procedurally.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
I second.
All right, Ms. Davis, would you call the roll, please?
Mr. Covington,
I vote against.
This is to recommend denial of the rezoning to the Board of.
Exactly. I don't want to say we're denying the rezoning.
Okay, as I interpret it, a yes vote means that you agree that the rezoning request should be denied.
So I said no. I do not support the motion.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, Mr. Covington is no.
okay, Mr. Kaufman,
No,
Ms. Hunter,
Yes.
Mr. Ellison,
Yes.
Mr. Strange,
Yes.
Ms. Macha.
No.
I vote yes.
Chair votes yes, and the motion passes. And I incorporate all the same comments that were made before when it was all discussed.
Mr.
All
Chair,
right.
May I interject something, Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
I was looking back at the applicant's June 7, 2019 letter, just to be clear, the city doesn't have an application form for rezonings. It's something for a long time I thought we should put something together. We haven't done it. Their letter does specifically say this is an application that portion be rezoned. So this is as close as it comes in the city to applying for a rezoning. So the city commissioners did refer to the planning commission based upon what is the closest thing we have to an application, just as a matter of historical reference.
Right.
All right. Well, the next matter on the agenda is the continued discussion of the comprehensive development plan. Do we need to take a break for 5 minutes before we start into that? Is there any feeling about that? Mr.
I
Kaufman?
support that.
I think we all do.
Let's reconvene at 3:10.
Okay.
10 minutes after 3. Thank you. Bob, I'm on a Zoom call. I'm sorry.
Nice to meet you, Mr. Ellison.
That'd be fine. Let me see.
Glad to be here.
That should be fine.
They gave us a 10-minute pee break, so I'm coming up to pee and then come up and give you a hug just for the help.
I didn't realize you were here. When they said it, then I remembered. Oh, goodness.
Yeah, I think I'll walk out to the hallway with live mics and everything else.
Yeah. glad when these are gone. It's hard to be in a meeting and,
I hate them. Well, I was in here on Monday. I don't think you were with us. And there was nobody else in the room, so I.
yeah, if you're the only one here, it doesn't make sense.
Right. And if you're, if I have to wear glasses, which I don't
Yeah.
for this kind of stuff, I mean, it gets fogged up. It's just awful, awful. Hard being an architect with all these lawyers.
Yeah.
And focus on this, what I call the soft issues. But they're important.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, see, it's never easy.
Yeah, when you're in planning, it's a little bit more, you understand that dynamic, but if you're an architect, it depends on what kind you're doing, I think, of how closely is the law and politics, how important it is. Morning, good afternoon, Mayor.
Hello.
How are you today?
Greetings. I'm well.
Dan, how are you?
Be aware, these are all live.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
So we can hear you, whatever you're saying.
Okay.
I'll clear your space here if you like.
Yeah, you look good in that. And then you're gonna come down to my office afterwards.
Just come around to here?
Yeah, come downstairs to my office.
I've never been there. I have a couple minutes, show me them, or just point the direction.
Absolutely. These microphones often catch people, 'cause the attorneys will be down here in a recess talking, and you can hear everything that's on.
And let me just say something to you privately, if I can.
Yeah.
I don't.
All right. Good job.
Hey.
Oh, Brian. Good, appreciate it. And I've been working very close to the city. I'm really bummed. I'm in the other camp. Yeah. That's why I started working on CDP.
It's not a perfect. Never been. I think it's just getting closer to being as clear as we can.
Oh.
Dynamics of the group, especially for lots of attorneys.
Well, I appreciate that. Your confidence in me too. Good, good. Thank you. You look good at that mayor's position.
Not a chance.
John.
There's no way to get around those.
Oh, I know. It just stays,
Stays live.
think before I speak and stay far away from it.
I hate these masks.
Yeah, I'll be so grateful when they're not required anymore.
I left my good one home, and I had this one that I've had since the very beginning, and it's terrible. But I left my other one at home, so I just had this one in the car just in case.
Back in the building, we were buying them back in the beginning. We were buying them right and left because we didn't know where this was going, and they fit horribly in the
Yes.
At least these, I feel like we found a brand that we like that we can get at Boscov's department store. So stocked up on those. They launder really well.
Ah,
Hopefully they'll last us.
yeah, it's just awful. I don't have all that many of them, but it is what it is.
Got 2 in my car, 2 in my partner's car, 2 in my dock kit. So no reason to be.
Right.
Are we back in session? Is everyone back and ready to go?
Yeah.
Is Nan there?
Yes, I'm here.
Can I make one point, Chair, please?
Yes,
By the way, just to Nan, to your comment, rezoning to commercial from residential is not considered a downzoning. It's considered an upzoning.
Oh, sorry.
Legally.
All right.
Just so you know.
Okay. Yeah,
I understand where you're.
I
understand where you're coming from, but it's
I
considered
understand.
an
It's
upzoning.
one of those things. It's like I always misuse that and which, those 2 words. So
It's an issue. It's an issue of intensity, is what it is. Okay.
I understand. I understand. Thank you for the correction, Steve.
Right.
All right, members of the commission, I'm looking at the draft CDP on a page which really is not numbered, but says Planning Commission Comments, Economic Development. Just want to make sure we're all on the same page of this document. And I'd like to turn it over to Lauren Good to continue the discussion, working through the last sections that we did not make, that we didn't finish the last time. Yes, Ms. Davis.
I have an issue with the slide and what you just held up. My understanding was that we were basing our discussion on provisions and on updating and revisiting, obviously, the 2010 CDP. This slide has 4 goals, 3 of which were in the 2010 CDP. One of them was not, the goal number 3, but at least as importantly, what is not included in this list of goals are 2 that are in the CDP: protect historic and characteristic structures and preserve Rehoboth's overall character and small town charm. Those 2 goals that were in the 2010 CDP are absent from this slide. Also, on the action side, not one of the 4 actions on this list was in the 2010 CDP. And for these reasons, I'm not sure where to go. I gathered from the question I asked at our last meeting that this slide was developed from goals and action items based on discussions in 2018, 2019 by the prior Planning Commission. But 5 of us, of our 9 members here today, we're not members of the Planning Commission at that time. We're not part of those discussions, not participants. And I don't think it's appropriate to be basing our discussions on the words on this page.
Okay, Ms. Lauren, are you available? Ms. Good.
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Okay. Can you please address Ms. Davis's concerns?
I can. The items that are on the screen, particularly the goals and action items, these were, I would say, in large part, the items that were developed by the prior consultant that was working on this plan. These were the ones, yes.
If I can interrupt, you have basically an echo going on. Is there another microphone on in your office by chance? Or I'll ask the moderator just to see what he thinks.
I believe it may actually be the one microphone she's using. It's not an echo, it is a disruption of the audio.
Okay.
Crackling.
Okay, Lauren, are you want to try again?
We've lost your audio now.
Okay.
You may be just trying to reset it for a moment.
Well, while we're waiting, I would like to just address Julie's comments for a minute. Can I do that?
Sure.
I understand where you're coming from, Julie, but there have been a lot of different changes on the board over time. And I don't see how we can go back and start over, but I do think that we can make modifications or add or subtract. There have been several different members of the Planning Commission since I first went on in, I think it was 2019. So what I would suggest is that if there are things you want to add, that we consider that. But I don't know how we can go backwards because a lot of this was also developed by citizen comment and surveys that were done. And so, it's kind of evolved up to here. So that's my suggestion that we go forward. And if you want to make some changes, let's consider them.
Well, I'm perfectly willing to go forward, but I'm just commenting on the fact that the base document that is on the agenda for discussion does not follow the text of the prior CDP or the 2015 CDP. And that being the case, I don't know why, because the prior slides, the prior visions, the prior material has been pretty much based on what the earlier document said. And this is not. And I realize there has been a change in leadership, change in membership, but I don't think that the 5 of us who were not part of developing the words on this page need to be tied to it. Now, you're right, we can change it and we can talk, we can wordsmith it and so forth, but I'll settle for whatever everybody else wants to do, but I think it's important to recognize where this document came from, where this wording came from, and where this wording by and large is not included, and the provisions of the 2010 CDP, which were readopted in 2015, are just not here.
Well, we all had opportunity to comment on everything that was here. So I assume everybody did submit their comments, and then we had a previous consultant who also looked at the surveys and everything else. I don't know how, these are not things that I don't think any one of the ones of us who were on before specifically said or didn't say. These are just the things that evolved through the process. So that's why I'm suggesting if you want to add something or make changes, that's what we ought to do. We certainly can't. We can't just throw these out.
You know, if you look at their historic, we have a section called historic resources. So it addresses, I think, Julie, what you're talking about. So protect historic and characteristic structures, preserve Rehoboth's overall character and small town charm. So even though it's not in the section you just referred to, it is in the historic resources section on page 23.
Well, I realize that protecting the city's small town charm is
and historic
appears throughout, but I think it's especially important that it be included also in economic development, because historic preservation has never been more
okay. Well, then we can add it
aspirational. Because economic development does, you know, is the as-built environment. Anyway, let's continue.
Okay.
Lauren, good. Are you back online?
I think so. Does that sound any better?
Much.
Great. Sorry about that.
You're not sharing your screen though at the moment.
Oh.
Your video.
How is that?
Good.
Great. Thank you. And just to clarify, these, as mentioned, the goals and action items for the most part were discussed and provided by the previous consultant working on this project. We made some minor tweaks to them, but since there was not that discussion about the appropriateness or desires to incorporate any others, we didn't want to tweak any of these too much since the prior consultant had been on board for a much longer time and had more interactions with the Planning Commission. So for the most part, we left these as they were forwarded to us as part of their draft documents. As also mentioned, we didn't reiterate the goals or action items in more than one place for the slides or within the text of the document. But again, if that's definitely if that's something that you would like us to, we can do that. However, I would recommend that we keep the action items piece of it, not duplicate those, but if there are any of those goals that you want to see spread in more than one place, we can certainly do that. So with that, I'll go ahead and just jump into this. Again, from our first draft, the goals that were included were to encourage creative redevelopment of selected properties, to increase the commercial viability and attractiveness of the identified streets, to increase economic development collaboration among private and public partnerships throughout the city, to provide a variety of commercial and service establishments, and to protect the character of distinctive groupings of buildings and streetscapes. The related action items were to continue to promote and support economic development programs and incentives, to support outdoor dining businesses, to continue to reevaluate the code and regulations, to remove any barriers or hurdles for redevelopment, and to continue to promote and evaluate the need to address parking during the peak season and promote transit as an alternative. So here we did have quite a few comments. So there was one suggested modification for goal number 4, and that's the one regarding protecting the character of distinctive groupings of buildings and streetscapes, and that was to add neighborhoods at the end of that at the end of that sentence. Then there were some additional suggested action items. One what for revising item B, which was supporting outdoor business dining businesses. That was more to evaluate the best ways to accommodate outdoor dining, and this relates to some of the discussions by the mayor and commissioner during their workshops, and the complexity of outdoor dining as a topic area for a variety of reasons. And then some revisions to item C, which was regarding revaluation of the code and regulations. And that's to add by providing clear and transparent code regulations and definitions. Beyond those revisions, it was also suggested that the action items also include greater coordination between the chambers and the county, and within the building and development community in general, and also including elected leaders of the various jurisdictions, and some more information about how this commenter felt that could be accomplished. A comment about targeting some marketing efforts to some higher socioeconomic groups that would include some social media, leveraging the Chamber of Main Street, and potentially offering some free Wi-Fi citywide. A nod to creating a business council, leveraging Main Street and the Chamber to promote and retain businesses and ensure occupancy, reviewing and updating the commercial code, working with commercial developers to guide them throughout the project process, and make sure that those applications get through the process in a reasonable period. Allowing more outdoor bar and restaurants in both in and out of the peak season, and then maintaining the cleanliness and safety and occupancy along the boardwalk and beach, and then enforcing the code and improvements to existing buildings. And then there were some general comments, which notes that the taking a look at the entire code will be a significant amount of work, and this is somewhere where the input from the business and development community, the public, is needed, as well as taking a look at parking during the peak seasons. Let's see. We also want to make sure that any note in the comprehensive plan doesn't or can't end up being used as evidence that current codes are rigid and inflexible. So we want to make sure that the terminology included is what you are looking for it to be. This commenter felt that there was no basis for the assertion that there are barriers or hurdles for redevelopment within the code. A suggestion about a study for the new understanding of destination vacations, and projecting tourist volume and understanding the related service improvements that would be needed to accommodate increases to the visitor volume. Let's see, the need for Rehoboth to remain a safe and clean city, cooperation between the city and businesses, and that some businesses don't feel that that exists as much as it should. Let's see, a note about the Wilmington Baltimore Streetscape project and its impacts to parking. This person noted that the ordinances are outdated and don't encourage a vibrant and cultural town. And then just a note about how COVID has changed the Rehoboth experience, not knowing when the end of that pandemic will be, and that due to that, many people will only want outdoor dining going into the future. So again, like our conversations on the past two sessions, we're looking for any comments or additional information or guidance about whether you're all in favor of any of these, or those items where there may be a conflict, needing to come to some kind of a resolution so that we can move forward with incorporating the right goals and action items for these topics. So with that, I will go ahead and turn that back over and kick off that discussion.
Okay, any of the members have anything to add to this, please? Yes, Mr. Strange.
Yeah, in keeping a comment Steve made earlier when we were talking about something else about the CDP as a policy document. And I think in many regards, even the 2010 CDP kind of went off the rails a little bit with regard to keeping it a policy document and really providing general guidance and allowing the specifics to be done within the municipality at the code and level. In this particular one, support outdoor dining businesses, which is put in there as an action item, implies that you don't support indoor dining businesses. And I think it really should be deleted. And in general, several things I think should be, in my opinion, should be deleted because it should be done at the highest policy level. And the guidance given on the left-hand side. Now, I know the Office of State Planning likes you to get very explicit, but I think that's to our detriment in a policy document. And so at least on that particular one, I would eliminate it personally and put more emphasis on the first, and even in the case of the fourth one on looking at promote and evaluate the need to address parking. I think that whole sentence should be replaced with to evaluate modal options, because I think it's presumptuous on our part to make assumptions as to what we think transportation modalities are going to look like 10 years from now or 20 years from now. And by way of example, if you look in the 2010 CDP and its update, there isn't any mention anywhere of 5G telecommunications. And yet that ended up being an extremely important flashpoint in the last few years. And yet the CDP was very effective from the standpoint of challenging some of the things that were being done by virtue of referring to the general state of viewscapes of our ocean and our beaches. And so I think here we're getting too much into the weeds, and that should be left for the municipality to determine. And we should keep it at a higher policy level as Steve recommended. I don't know if Steve will agree or disagree with me on that, but.
I think it's a good suggestion. Okay. I had something, Mr. Chair, if I could.
Yes, sir. Please.
I noticed there were a number of folks who had some problems with action item C because of the term to remove barriers and hurdles for redevelopment. So what I would suggest there is a modification to have it read, continue to reevaluate the code and regulations of the city by providing flexible standards. And I think that would remove the concerns that those others had. I don't have a problem with those terms, but I think that that would address it by just having it say by providing flexible standards and removing the language to remove barriers and hurdles for redevelopment. So that's what I would suggest.
No, I agree with Steve.
Okay.
What do we mean by flexible standards?
Yeah.
I mean, is this going to be a provision that depending on who's quoting it, on what side of a proposed development project, the standards either are or are not flexible? That's in the eye of the beholder.
Julie, what
That's
I think—
the kind of language that I think you get in trouble with.
Well, what I think it means is that when you review the codes and you adopt new code, new categories, you would have some standards within the zoning category that would be flexible based upon based upon the application and proffers and so on that would be made. There's usually ranges of things like density and uses and so on. So you don't want a very rigid code. You want to have some flexibility in it. That's what that means.
Well, in the 2010 document, there are several references to removing unnecessary regulatory procedures and unnecessary development regulations, and then providing a flexible means to granting relief.
Oh, I think that's fine too. That's fine language. I don't have a problem with that.
Ms. Hunter.
Well, I think the language that Julie just quoted from the 2010 CDP is quite a lot better. I do think that this flexible, I mean, flexible is a good thing. So it's consistent, consistent applications that, of the rules. I think we should just be careful about the language that we impose here, because I can imagine any number of situations in which various parties on either side of a proposal would want flexibility or might want consistent application of the existing code that has been applied to everybody else. I really encourage people to think twice about how some of these words can cut, because they may seem to cut one way in the context of the applications and discussions that we've had for the last 90 days. And a year or two, not to mention 10 years from now, they might cut a very different way. So I think when we make recommendations, I think we should really pay attention to the language, because I think just this exchange between Julie and Steve, I mean, it ended with agreement, and that's great. Except that I think that language is different. I think if you look at the two pieces of text, they're susceptible to different meanings. It's a very challenging enterprise because we are dealing with a document that sets out general policy and can be subject to interpretation, but it's intended to guide interpretation. So, I think the remove barriers and hurdles, that was certainly something that I objected to, because it implied that there are that some of the procedures that we or other parts of the city enforce are just barriers and hurdles, and people ought to be able to do whatever they want, with their property. And I strongly object to that. So I guess my point is that A, it's very difficult for any 9 people to draft anything. But B, I would encourage the consultant to be prudent and cautious in terms of picking up language from our various comments. We're now all sort of like commenting on this language, and it's not entirely clear to me how that's going to affect what the final text of this document will be. So that's my comment on this.
All right. Yes, Rachel.
I guess I would like to take this up a little bit of a level, because I agree we're a bit in the weeds, but I think this is a very important section of the CDP in light of the fact that we are, have been coming through COVID. We've sustained a pretty dramatic, at least first phase of the pandemic. And I think there's a lot to be learned here for this document as we draw upon kind of what we have for learnings in this kind of first phase. I mean, we really don't know when we'll ultimately be out of a pandemic, but I think we need to operate differently as a city as it relates to economic development. And I think there's a big opportunity here for us to look outside of our city and even do some benchmarking with other towns that are similar to us, and really try to build some bridges to understand some of the complexities and issues as well. So I think there's a big opportunity here to really strengthen this section by drawing upon kind of where we've been over the last 18 months or so, but also where we need to also be thinking forward and what we can be doing to learn what other towns are doing, so we can streamline those learnings and not make some of the same mistakes.
Okay. Mr. Dewey, did you have your hand up, sir?
No, other than to acknowledge that I also have some problems around item C, the way it's currently worded. I was listening to comments made by both Julie and Nan And I support both of those persons' arguments.
Okay.
I'd like to make a
Yes, ma'am.
proposal, or at least note, on the goals section. Number 1 is encourage creative redevelopment of selected properties on Rehoboth Avenue and other commercial areas. We have seen that statement, that sentence, many, many times in recent months to justify a number of proposed projects. Standing by itself, it can be, to some extent, I don't have any problems with it unless, you also insert what in the 2010 CDP are 2 prior provisions, which, as I said earlier, the document starts out goals: protect historic and characteristic studies, preserve Rehoboth's overall character and small town charm. Then and only then do you get to this sentence of encouraging creative redevelopment of selected properties. And I think the whole picture needs to start out with the basic principles of where we want to go with this. And I disagree to some extent with Mike Strange in that this is not just to develop a policy document. As we know, we are told over and over again that a CDP has the force of law. And therefore, you have to be very, very careful what your terminology is, because it can come back to bite whatever side of any proposal you're on. So it's not just a high-level aspirational document with, goals. And if we can get around to it, let's, have an architectural review board or whatever. I think that it's very important that we think of it. And, the next court case where one side or the other or both. And Steve is right. People pull out these statements from the CDP depending on what they want to do with them. But at least we can do something to try to make the statements themselves have more clarity. And lastly, in that regard, if we're going to talk about looking at the zoning code and regulations of the city, or more broadly, the code and regulations, that would include site plan and subdivision. One of the biggest single problems, as far as I'm concerned, with our code is it is extremely ambiguous in some very important places. And this document ought to, instead of talking about removing barriers and hurdles, we ought to be working toward a clear, consistent, unambiguous set of codes and regulations. And I think that's important to put in here too.
Lauren, I'm sorry, Mr. Kaufman.
Julie, did you want to precede the first goal by the statement that you said about preservation of the city's character? Do you want to add that in front of it?
Yeah,
is that what you're saying?
Bullet points in the 2010 CDP.
Okay.
One is protecting historic and characteristic structures, and the second is preserving Rehoboth's overall character and small town charm. And this can be found on pages 75 and 76 of this 2010.
So are you saying to add that? I'm not quite sure where you want to go.
I'd like to add those 2 points to the beginning of the goals section.
I don't have an issue with that. I'm fine with that. As to the reevaluation of the code, I mean, I think everybody realizes our code needs to be changed. It needs to be more. It needs to be clearer. It needs to be more consistent, and it needs to be brought up to date. So we can't just take that out. We could just say continue to reevaluate the code and regulations of the city for redevelopment, or for I'm not quite sure what to say, but I think you have to keep something in there where you continue to reevaluate the code and regulations of the city so that they are really more modern than they are now. But I don't have a problem taking out the remove the barriers and hurdles, but you got to keep something in there. I'm not quite sure what language to
take out paragraph C. I was proposing, I would certainly take out the remove barriers and hurdles language, but I was proposing to include the thought that if we should, when we're going to be reevaluating it and updating it, that's fine. But we keep an eye with a view to making sure that the provisions are clear and consistent and unambiguous.
That's good. I don't have a bit of problem with that. So,
Anyone else?
that's all.
Lauren, good. Have you heard what you need to hear on this point?
I believe so. If I could go back to the item related to support for outdoor dining businesses. In the written comments, there were definitely pros and cons, or those that seemed to be for or and against keeping that item. And there was some talk about that being too in the weeds. Is that something that we want removed, or perhaps something that's tied to, something to the effect of looking at the code with the lens of what's happened with COVID-19 and making sure that there are adequate provisions in place to address those types of future uses that may arise out of that. Crafting language on the spot is not. Writing something is a little bit easier for me, so I hope you get the gist of what was meant by that.
Yeah, Lauren, I understand what you're saying. I mean, my thinking was outdoor dining is kind of a silver lining, right? Something that we learned going through a terrible situation in this pandemic. And I think it is something, as we look forward, we don't know exactly when we're going to come out of this. I do think we need to think about how do we serve, right, the folks in our town that want to bring business to us and keep the merchants in business and restaurants. I think we need to be, you don't like the word flexible, I'm sure, but I think we need to be much more open to providing the right services for our patrons. And I think outdoor dining is one of them that we've learned.
Just a technical point, in commercial zones, unless you say you can, outdoor dining is permitted, it isn't. So you've got to have something in the code that permits outdoor dining. I don't know what the right language is, but I think that the goal is that future commercial codes should have the ability to be flexible enough to provide for outdoor dining. If you don't do that, it's not permitted as a matter of law. So.
And to date, Rehoboth hasn't permitted it. I think we made an exception, right? During the pandemic, is my understanding. And the Board of Commissioners.
I think that's what they did do, right? Because yes. The current code doesn't permit it as a matter of right. So,
and that's why I think getting back to Section C under action items, that's why I think that should stay in there. You can remove the code, reevaluate the code, but we're talking about being flexible with regulations. This is a prime example of how we did it and how we should do it.
But the city has the ability to do it on an emergency basis, which is exactly what they did do, to then allow all of the outdoor dining that has materialized during COVID. I don't know that you have to going back to what Nan said. Flexibility cuts both ways, and I think we need to be more precise.
It does flex.
May I just suggest that I would just like to say that in some ways I agree very much with Rachel in the sense that I think we all learned a lot, so far during this pandemic, and nobody here, and seemingly pretty much nobody anywhere, really has any claim to be able to predict what the future phases of this disease are going to bring us. The particular outdoor dining example is one of many things that happen pursuant to a declaration of a public health emergency. But I think a specific recommendation could be, again, to go along the lines of a lesson, that the city consider whether to make outdoor dining some kind of provision along with all the other, zoning code amendments that we hope the city will at least consider whether to make that permanent. To make the exception there. I don't have the expertise to have an opinion about whether that makes sense or whether it makes sense to the current extent that it's being done. But that's a specific recommendation to consider a change in the future. And in terms of what other kinds of changes might happen as a result of this pandemic, I just think we don't know. So that would be my suggestion.
I think it's important
with respect to outdoor dining, as you know, the code does have provisions for patio dining, but that's a very different set.
You're breaking up, Julie.
That allowing restaurants that have been indoor without any provision for patio dining to just put tables and chairs on sidewalks, which I personally thought was a very good, development during COVID, and I'd like to see it continue. But as a zoning matter, it's not.
I think the CDP document that we're putting forward is a document that has a 10-year horizon, and it should be offering guidance on how to be adaptable to unforeseen things that come up. And in the 2015 one, we didn't know about the pandemic. We don't know if in the next 5 years there's an economic downturn or, God forbid, a spill on the ocean. There's a lot of things that the city's plan needs to provide guidance on. It's hard for a plan, though, to provide detailed solutions. And I've seen things like this treated as an example, but it's hard to get into offering too many solutions with this policy plan. It's better to leave that to hazard mitigation or business ordinances or things like that. But this plan should be saying that the city needs to be adaptable for anything that can come up. And it should speak to what does that mean? It means that you're holding meetings, you're talking about you're bringing working groups together to find solutions out. But it's hard to talk about in any of these sections what is the proper solution for it, because 2 years or 3 years from now, it's very important now, but it's probably going to be something different. And the real thing to say in the plan is how does an organization remain adaptable, and what does it do to unforeseen things? So it's good as an example, but I'm not sure I would get into too much code discussions or other things on this specific topic.
All right, Tom, I agree with that. I think, again, we need to stay away from solutions and stay with policy and the mechanics of how to get from here to there.
I do want to come back to the terminology discussion too, which I think was really good. The CDP does need to be a policy document that's setting a guide. And it does become problematic if ordinances are ambiguous and the CDP is ambiguous. I don't know that we repeat in each section the small town character or other aspects like that, but we do have the section on community character and the position. It should be pretty clear in that section, what do we mean by small town character and how all of these other aspects, goals would relate to that. And I agree that we don't want to lose it, and it's important, and it really, I think I heard the term being too ambiguous. It's got to be as clear as it can be in that section so that it provides the guidance moving forward for all these other parts that we're talking about. That is the primary purpose of a CDP. It's not to define language in code, but it is to set as clear and as a consistent vision for the community. And I think your community character section is really one of the most important things, because that's where you get into how do staff, when they're out looking at their ordinance, what do they need to relate to, or zoning change, or variance approvals. It all needs to come back to the vision for the community, which is not ordinance language, but it's something that at the end of the day, it's a shared vision. It's bringing together the residents' concerns, the business community, and the visitors and providing, you may not get unanimous decision on what it is, but it's a shared one and it's adopted, and hopefully it's something that can be as clear as possible so that when you're making decisions, you're not reacting to everything, you're applying that same vision.
Steve Kaufman.
Well, I think this issue of outdoor dining is very significant. Actually, it's a national trend. It had, even before the pandemic, it's become a very popular thing all over the country. So I think we need to put something in there about the evaluation of the code, but there should be consideration of making outdoor dining a permanent permitted use with certain standards, threshold standards. So I don't want to leave it because I think it's going to be very necessary, certainly now, but in the future, it will also be very popular now that it's started. I think Julie will recognize in Bethesda, for example, in Bethesda Row there, they couldn't have outdoor dining until there was a code change. And that was before the pandemic. And that's become very popular, as you know. So I think we need to put something in here about outdoor dining, and that it should be seriously considered to become permanent.
I have a question for Glenn. And that is, and I wasn't very clear a minute ago, and I'm sorry, when I made the point about we already have in the zoning code provisions for patio dining. That dining is, however, is on the property owner's property. It's adjacent to a restaurant. The outdoor dining that I think we saw during the pandemic was outdoor dining on public property. The city allowed tables and chairs to be put out on city sidewalks and into city streets in some instances. I don't see that as a zoning issue, but maybe it is a zoning issue. But it's basically the city allowed for, as I say, in a sort of emergency scheme, that outdoor dining to take place on city property. Is that
that's exactly what happened in Montgomery County to allow it on public property on the sidewalks.
But was it an amendment to the zoning code is my question, as opposed to some other code where the city and the county controls its own property and decides what uses it can be put to and revise the code or the regulations to allow outdoor dining on public property as opposed to private property. Now, if this is getting too much in the weeds, thank you, Rachel, for, I think trying to keep us out of them. But if this is an important issue, I think that's an important distinction.
Well, I think the issue that you're talking about that you probably should perhaps consider is the one that Julie just raised, which is the use of public lands for private businesses outdoor dining. Because Julie's right, in the zoning code, there's currently provisions for outdoor dining up to 750 square feet on the private property owner's property. But during the pandemic, for the first time, the city allowed outdoor dining on public lands, on city lands. So I think that does require, if you're going to allow it to go, if you think it's something worthwhile going forward, even in a non-pandemic circumstance, it probably is something that you should address in the CDP. Because the CDP is a land use plan being all land, whereas the zoning code really is about the regulation of private property. The CDP is inclusive of both private and public lands. So if you as a planning commission think that outdoor dining on city property as a matter of policy is something you'd like to encourage, then there probably should be some recognition of that in the plan somewhere. Because currently there's nothing in the city code that would permit it. It's only due to the pandemic and the governor's order that allowed for these sorts of outdoor dining opportunities.
If my recollection serves me right, Julie, I think in Montgomery County, it was both an amendment to the zoning code and to the city's other codes dealing with infrastructure, which is owned by the city. I think we definitely should have something that encourages it or encourages consideration of it by the city.
Mr. Strange.
That's just the ability
Yeah.
have it.
Go ahead, Rachel. I'll talk after you.
No, I was just saying, just tagging on that formalizes the opportunity to offer outdoor dining. But I think, just back to my comment, a few minutes ago, I think we should certainly tie it back to a learning that we've seen and looking forward, how life has changed, right? And I think this is something that we need to offer.
I think playing into it, what Glenn, Rachel, and Stephen pointed out is trends continue until they don't. But in this particular case, it was really disaster or emergency response was the primary issue.
Right.
And they realized from an economic standpoint that a lot of the businesses, the restaurants were going to go under if they didn't have other options. And so I would just pose for consideration that is it under economic development, or is this really a response to disaster planning? Where's the appropriate place for it? So it's as was pointed out, the next thing that comes down the pike could be something totally different. And we may have to respond differently. And this becomes the least of our worries. So whether it's here or somewhere else, I think it might be more appropriate if it was under disaster management.
Okay. Lauren, good. Before we move to a next topic, what would you consider the next topic to be to begin with? And is this a good break point to basically defer until the next meeting, a discussion of the next topic? There are some housekeeping things that I think we need to talk about before we adjourn today at 4:30 or right before that. Is this a good point to stop and pick up again later?
I think that could work. Whenever the next meeting is where we are discussing these specifically, rather than the current, I guess, topics arranged how they are, I would suggest that the next topic that we pick up be the one on land use and annexation, since that is obviously a very important topic. And then the remaining items, while still important, there were not as many comments related to those that needed some additional interpretation, if you will. So those would include some of the items on infrastructure, services, and then the community profile. Transportation is another one with a number of comments. So I would suggest when it does get picked back up, that land use and transportation be the big discussions that we hold. That being said, I did want to clarify that for the joint meeting, those discussions were, we were anticipating discussing comments based on draft number 2, which the items that are included within this presentation still have those same components incorporated. So we intentionally did not modify, for example, any of the goals or action items based on topics that we hadn't yet discussed. So we can structure that discussion as well to put more of the focus on those items up front.
Let's talk about where we are and where we aren't. We have a joint meeting next Wednesday, the 15th, with the Board of Commissioners that begins, as I recollect, at 10 a.m. Currently, we had discussed previously the prospect of meeting in late December or very early January. And then at that particular time, as things evolved really, it appeared that we might not need the early January meeting. But I'm sensing just from what we did today and where we got and where we didn't, that we are going to need another Planning Commission meeting on the CDP, certainly before the January 14th joint meeting with the Board of Commissioners. And I'd like to know your thoughts. I think there's been some sentiment that we ought to leave the end of the last week of December alone and leave that as a quiet time for everyone. The question then becomes, do we want to pick up on the 4th or 5th of January for another PC meeting in advance of the January 14th joint meeting with the Board of Commissioners. Now, I know I'm throwing a lot of dates at you. You don't necessarily have to agree on this today, but I think it ought to be something that everybody's aware of, that I think we need more work to get where we're going. At least one.
Mike, could I just ask a couple of clarifying questions?
Sure.
I appreciate the opportunity, frankly, to make sure my calendar is correct. So we have the meeting next week, the 15th, starting at 10 a.m. I mean, I almost hesitate to raise this point, but do we have an agreement or whatever? I mean, what is the length of that meeting going to be?
I believe that meeting is going to be approximately 2.5 hours long.
Okay, so
consistent with what we do here. That is a planning commission meeting.
Right.
It's not.
I'm sorry. I thought that was a joint meeting.
It is a joint meeting, but the mayor has asked that the planning commission run the meeting.
Okay. All right. Now I have on my calendar, and maybe this has just been overtaken by events, I have a January 3 meeting at 10 a.m. We
did discuss that, and that was subsequently thought not to be necessary, but what I'm suggesting is it may be necessary.
Okay. All right. And then the January 14th meeting, that's the only other meeting that I have before February 1. And I have that as a regular meeting of the Planning Commission.
Okay, I'm glad we're having this discussion, because from what I think has happened since that time, the 14th of January is another Planning Commission joint meeting with the Board of Commissioners. Then we had discussed having a meeting on the 21st to, and at that meeting, that January 14th meeting, it's a discussion of the CDP prior to the plus application, to finalize the plus application. Then we had discussed having a meeting on the 21st, the following Friday, to approve the CDP before it gets filed with the state on February 1st.
Okay. And I hope this is useful to other people and not just my own confusion. I apologize if it's the latter. But with regard to January 14th, that is our regular meeting day.
Right. Yeah, but we're going to have it as a joint meeting with the Board of Commissioners.
Okay. All right.
And then discussions were held, and a lot of this is internal stuff, talking with Lauren, talking with Tom, talking with the mayor, and then again, it evolves because I'm trying to assess what progress we are or are not making, and how many meetings we need to get our work accomplished. So we had talked initially about a January 21st meeting of the Planning Commission, a special meeting, but I understand from the city secretary that that date is not available. So the question is, if we, from January 14th, do we then go to the 24th or 25th for another CDP meeting to work out any final issues that we might have? Because this thing's going to get filed, it's got to get filed on February 1st. So what I'm suggesting to you is, it seems there are two options. One, we can hold the January 14th joint meeting and either meet on the 3rd or the 4th of January in advance of that meeting, or we can have the January 14th meeting and then come back on the 24th or 25th and have another Planning Commission meeting. In some sense, I think we may get more done if we meet on January 3rd or 4th.
Mm-hmm.
Steve.
Okay, and again, I apologize for this question, but according to my notes, the final third draft will be released by the consultant on December 21.
Correct.
Is that correct?
That is correct. And that's when we're opening up for public comment. And we do want those comments to be in writing from the public. But that's right. December 21st is an important milepost. That's when we release the draft plan number 3 to the Planning Commission, the Board of Commissioners, and the public for written comment by the public. So I'm glad you're asking this question, Jan. And man, I'm glad you're asking this question, because I needed to get my calendar straight, because I'm not sure I had it straight.
Excuse me, Chair.
Yes, ma'am.
On January 24th, that's Parks and Shade Tree Commission in the morning and Board of Adjustment in the afternoon. So that's already booked up.
All right.
And on the 25th, the Board of Commissioners will be meeting as a special meeting.
What do you got on January 3rd or 4th? Or 5th?
Okay, the 4th is a special meeting with the Board of Commissioners. The 3rd is open. The 5th is open.
How do the members of the commission feel about January 5th? That's a Wednesday. Gets us a little bit of distance from the holidays. Time to sort of settle back into a routine again. And our routine now is to have a meeting about every week.
I couldn't do the 3rd anyway, so I could do the 5th.
Okay. How's January 5th sound? Mike Strange says fine.
Okay, by me.
Julie, John, Barry, what do you think?
Yeah.
Wait a minute, Julie, are you, I can't hear Julie.
You muted, Julie.
What time, Mike?
2 o'clock.
I am actually not, at this point, I'm not available the afternoon of the 5th.
Okay, how about what time do you start in the afternoon on the 5th?
I have a meeting that is pretty much that entire afternoon, 1 to 4.
Okay, so if we met from 10 to 12 on that morning, would that work?
Yes, I could make that work.
How about the rest of the members? How about 10 a.m. to 12 on January 5th? Let's have a show of hands. I'm seeing a lot of good things happening here.
I cannot chair, but you don't need me just for a CDP discussion. So don't allow my calendar to dictate that meeting. If the membership can make it, you should go forward with it.
Okay. All right, January 5th at 10 o'clock, we have a planning commission meeting. And then we'll meet on the 14th of January, and there we go.
What about the 25th or 6th? What about, I mean, are we?
Let's do this. Let's have the January 5th meeting and see how we do.
Okay. We didn't get very far today. I'll try to be quiet.
Well, I was going to say, I think we may need to put a governor on some.
I do have a follow-up question. We had discussed that January 21st meeting to be where we would get the okay to submit to Plus. And I just wanted to clarify that this is not the Planning Commission approving the document. It is the Planning Commission basically giving us the okay to submit the document to the state for the Plus agency review, because you'd still have to hear their comments, incorporate any changes that are necessary based on those comments, and hold an actual public hearing before you make the recommendation to the Board of Commissioners to adopt the plan. And then it goes to them for their review and adoption. So one, I wanted to make that point of clarification, but two, just to make sure that we are, keeping that in mind, would you then be, if we're taking the January 21st meeting off the table, would that then occur as part of the January 14th meeting? Or is that where you're saying that you want to wait and see how those meetings go and then set an additional meeting between the 14th and the end of the month?
Well,
keeping in mind that whatever changes that come out of that later meeting, we'll need enough time to make adjustments to the draft as necessary in order to get them into the draft that goes to Plus. So, waiting until the very last day of the month would not be our recommended approach, let's say.
Well, then do we need a very brief meeting on the 24th or 25th of January? For that purpose, just to approve the release of the filing of the CDP with Plus, so that Wallace Montgomery has that assurance and has that in their file?
I think it would be prudent to schedule an additional meeting between January 14th and, let's say, January 28th, if we can find a time, and we can always happily cancel it.
How about January 20th?
Good for me.
Thursday, show of hands, 2 o'clock. Lauren, does that work?
Yes, that works for me.
2 o'clock on, and Womack, does that work?
I don't have any other meetings scheduled, but previously you had asked me to put in January 28th as a tentative date. Do you still want to have that date?
No, that's too close to the filing date on February 1st. That leaves Wallace Montgomery in a real bind if changes are made at the last minute. And I'd rather the last minute take place on the 20th of January than the 28th.
Okay, and then you said at 2 o'clock?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
So, so Mike, you've got the following meetings. We have the joint meeting on the 15th. We have a regular meeting on the 14th. We have a meeting on the 5th of January, 10 to 12. And now you've got a meeting on the 20th of January at 2 p.m.
Correct.
And, but on the 21st, the third draft will be delivered to us and the Board of Commissioners. Is that it?
December 21st.
December
21st. December 21st. Right.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
I'll put out a revised agenda for everybody. I'll put something and send it around so that we're all.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, we can all get off the same sheet. Okay, let me look at my notes and see if there's anything else. Matt, Janice, did you have a building inspector's report you wanted to submit today? There was something in the agenda on it.
If it was not forwarded to you, I apologize. We'll get it to you post haste.
No, I received something, but I'm not sure we need to go through it today. Can that be deferred?
Absolutely, and unless you have specific questions, I really don't have anything to say about it.
Okay, and Glenn Mandalis, did you have any kind of solicitor's report today?
The only thing I wanted to mention, Chair, is that last Wednesday we had oral arguments in the clear space litigation on basically this question of what constitutes the record. So the judge didn't make any decisions, but that oral argument was had, and at some point the judge will make a determination.
So the judge has not put any kind of a schedule on in terms of when you might anticipate a ruling?
No, he hasn't, but my expectation is so they're going to get the transcripts back. Some cases were referenced that one side didn't have, and they want the opportunity the clear space team wants the opportunity to review those cases and see if they need to provide some written submission further to the court. And then after that, I would expect this judge probably within 2 to 3 weeks to have a decision. So I don't think it'll be a real lengthy time, but still several weeks before that issue is determined.
Has a trial been set?
No.
Okay. And just as on a personal note, I've been coughing a bit, and I'm sorry for that. I've been through basically a sinus infection, and I'm on the outside looking back in, fortunately, so I'm doing better. But I apologize. Sometimes I just have a cough, but all is doing better, and so Z-Packs are the modern medical cure. All right, with that, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. We're adjourned.
Thank you.